Kevin Dellicker, Republican for Congress in District 7. Why are you running for this office?
I'm running to keep America free. I've had an amazing life. I've been able to serve my country for 28 years. I've been able to own my own business for 18 years. I've raised 3 boys in northwestern Lehigh County with my wife, Susan, and I've truly lived the American dream. But I'm worried that that dream is becoming out of reach for many of the people that live in Pennsylvania's 7th District and people around the country. I think that the priorities and the policies that are coming out of President Biden and Susan Wild are hurting Americans. They're making us less safe. They're causing prices to be too high, and they're taking away our freedoms. So I'm offering an alternative to that, a common sense conservative with lots of relevant life experiences who intends to go to Washington, take on these difficult problems, get the job done, and then go back home to Gurmansville, where I belong.
And before we examine your policies, Kevin, which part of Pennsylvania makes up this district?
So Pennsylvania's 7th District is Lehigh County, Carbon County, Northampton County, and part of Monroe County. So it's the Lehigh Valley plus Carbon County and even extending a little bit into the Poconos. It's a beautiful area. It's a microcosm of the United States. It includes some wonderful cities and small towns, a lot of very rural areas, which is where I grew up. And I just love living where I live. I've been there for 40 years. And I would rather be there than Washington, I must say. But there's a job to be done, and that's why I'm running for office.
So you've been in District 7 40 years?
Yes. I moved out for a time. I lived in Harrisburg for a little bit, and I moved away when I was in the military, and I was gone for some other times when I lived in New York. But for the most part, I went to kindergarten in Northwestern. I graduated from Northwestern Lehigh High School. And then when I came back home and started to raise my kids, Susan came with me. She's originally from Pittsburgh, and we've settled in the same school district that I grew up in. And yeah, I'm 40 years and counting now in northwestern Lehigh County.
Kevin, I understand you're a small business owner, so tell us about your product or service.
I am. So my wife, Susan, and I started Dellicker Strategies in the basement of our home 18 years ago. It was quite an experience. I built a home office in the basement while Susan was upstairs with 3 babies crawling all around her while she was keeping the books and doing all the accounting. And our product at the time was helping school districts upgrade their broadband infrastructure. And we had this idea that if we could help organize school districts so that they could work together, they could get a better price by cooperating instead of buying the services on their own. It worked great. And we've ended up doing projects like that all across Pennsylvania and New Jersey and some other states as well. We expanded outside of school districts and did hospitals and private businesses and universities. And so our premise is to save taxpayers money by upgrading infrastructure in the technology space and letting people like school districts and teachers have better technology to educate students. And we are at $550 million in taxpayer savings and counting so far with our business. We've expanded. We also do cybersecurity work now, so we help organizations protect their critical infrastructure. And it's been my livelihood for the past 18 years. I enjoy the work that I do, and I still operate the business out of my home office in Gurmansville, Pennsylvania.
While you were working with the school districts during the COVID pandemic, how did that affect demand for your services?
Well, just like all the other businesses, we were given the shutdown order and we couldn't go and do our work in person. And at the time, I was in the middle of a big project in New Jersey where we were helping school districts upgrade their cybersecurity. So what I had to do as a business owner is retool and revamp that whole process so that instead of delivering all those services and training and that project-based work in person, which I was doing at the time, we had to do it all online. So we adapted, we regrouped, and we did like a lot of businesses were able to do. You know, American entrepreneurism and ingenuity is still alive and well in our country, but that's what we had to do to survive. And we ended up thriving after we went through that process.
Yeah, talk more about how you've expanded the business, and certainly you can measure success by expanding to other school districts. And about how many school districts do you have on board for your business?
Well, we don't just work with school districts, but school districts is a big part of our business platform. our little company based in Gurmansville, Pennsylvania, has actually served almost 2/3 of all the school districts in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. That's quite an accomplishment. And we've been able to help all those different organizations. It's not just school districts, it's Catholic schools and private schools as well. Some charter schools are also in the mix by upgrading their technology infrastructure.
And what are some of the routine tasks you help them with? Give us some examples.
Well, we broker the agreements with the vendors. My company doesn't go and hang wires on telephone poles. We help to figure out the amount of service that organizations may need.
I see.
And then we help them source it, apply it, negotiate it, and get that deal put in place.
Now, I understand you were a policy advisor to the New York Senate. Is that right?
Boy, that was a long time ago.
So I'm going to test your memory a little bit.
Yes.
What did you work on in basic terms?
So I had an internship in the state of New York, and they placed me with the New York State Senate Republican office.
You were in your early 20s, I'm guessing?
I was. It was my first job out of graduate school. I went to Syracuse University after I went to Penn State. And the timing of that placement was I arrived in September. And the election of 1994, when all those Republicans won all over the country, like Newt Gingrich and George Pataki in New York State, they didn't have enough Republicans in New York to go around. So they hired me out of that internship and gave me a very high-ranking position in the New York State Republican caucus to help negotiate bills related to environmental policy and economic development.
So you were young when you were plunged into this political world.
I was extremely young.
It must have made some impressions on a young man.
It did. And I went from New York to Pennsylvania, where I got a similar job working for the Ridge administration. And I ended up becoming the economic policy advisor to Ridge during his second term. And I had the honor of working on his signature tax cut proposal, which became the largest tax cut in Pennsylvania history. And I was really plugging along in government and was on my way probably to becoming a professional politician if there wasn't something that intervened and changed my life. And that was 9/11. I had enlisted in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard in 1995, and I was trained as an infantry soldier. And I got my commission in the United States Air Force and started to serve at the 193rd Special Operations Wing right here in Middletown. Right when I came back from training with my wife, Susan, and my first son, who was a year old, was when 9/11 hit. And I had taken a leave of absence from my work in the Ridge administration, and I went overseas for the first rotation for Operation Enduring Freedom. When I came home and went back to the office—
Wait, Kevin, what was your experience like over there? Just give us some insight into what you saw, what you did.
Well, I deployed for Operation Enduring Freedom, which is the war in Afghanistan, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, 4 different times. So I went to the combat zone in 2001, 2003, 2007, and again in 2009. And I did it all as a guardsman, having a regular civilian job and then being called up and deployed overseas to fulfill that federal mission. It's an amazing experience to be a citizen soldier. It's one of the most exciting and terrifying things that I think a person can do. We ask so much of our reservists and National Guardsmen. I've been doing it for 28 years. Today, I'm the commander of a unit in Willow Grove, where I actually am involved with the MQ-9 Reaper, which is the hunter-killer drones that do the counterterrorism work all around the world. So it's a grave responsibility. Of course, I'm running for office as a private citizen, and I'm here in that capacity wearing a tie and a jacket, not in a military uniform. So the Department of Defense does not have any endorsements of my campaign. There's my mandatory disclaimer when I talk about my military service. But
let's return to your story. After you completed the military service, you came home, so take it from there.
I came home and I really didn't want to be in state government anymore. My outlook had changed. I suppose my mind was still overseas, thinking about the war. And Tom Ridge had left. He was selected to be the first Secretary of Homeland Security. Right. So there were changes that were occurring. And I started to work for a small technology company in Harrisburg, where I learned more about technology and broadband infrastructure and these things. And that is really where I gained some outstanding experience that allowed me to start that business in the first place. So thank goodness it happened, because I think one of the big problems that we have in our politics today is people that enter government service as an elected official and they never leave. Certainly we need people who are professional staff members and they work in agencies, and I have no problem with that. But our elected officials, in my opinion, ought to be people who arrive in Harrisburg or in Washington with experience in some relevant profession, that they're at their top of their game and they can serve for a brief period and then go back home. When public service becomes your livelihood, then that's when we get into all sorts of problems. And that's the opposite of what I am. I did that service until I was about 30 years old, but then I got out in the private sector. I started my own business, which I've been running for the past 18 years. And now I want to come back in because the skills that I've learned as a business owner, as a military commander, as somebody who's deeply involved in my community, are relevant to those issues that we're tackling in Washington today.
Yeah, so let's continue in that vein, Kevin, and consider your positions on the issues. And I was looking at your website before the interview, and you maintain that families are under attack. Why do you feel that way, and what should be done?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. All of the fentanyl that's being, pushed into our country and smuggled across the border. When I go out and about and talk to people in the 7th District, there's really 3 issues that I hear about most of all. Number one, people are worried about the economy. They're having a hard time paying their bills. They can't believe the level of inflation that they're dealing with right now. This is affecting senior citizens. It's affecting working families. It's affecting our weakest and most vulnerable citizenry who are trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And there's no end in sight. And the Democrats in Washington are just doubling down on this massive spending program that they've been acting. And I think that's the reason why we have the inflation. And the way that you fix it is by controlling spending and get these budget deficits back under control. Let's talk about the border. And I mentioned the fentanyl. It's not just drugs that are being smuggled across the border. It's people. That's human trafficking. And this is a crisis of humanity that's happening at the border. And we have no security. It's a national security risk. It's putting people at risk, not just the migrants that are trying to come across the border, but people in our communities that are seeing this expressed in so many different ways. Joe Biden and the Democrats have the wherewithal to close that border. They just don't have the will. And I fully support efforts by congressional Republicans to try to take tough provisions that close these loopholes when it comes to the asylum policies that we have and the parole policies that we have, and put more physical barriers in place so that we can keep people out. This latest episode where Texas is trying to put barriers up so the migrants don't cross into their state, and now the federal government is cutting through the concertina wire. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't think it makes sense to most Americans.
Here's another point you assert on your website. Students are indoctrinated, you say, with deceptive social theories. So give us some examples.
So I've been working with school districts for a long, long time, and I have a great relationship with many school administrators. My wife is a school teacher, and there are a lot of public schools that are doing really great things, but parents need to be in charge of their students' education. There are a lot of parents that are extremely worried about the content of the materials that people are being presented, that their children are being presented in school. And that's a real threat. And I think that while it's very important to take a look at the books that are in the library, for me, the real danger that I see for young people is the phones that are in their pockets. The amount of smut and horrible materials that our children are exposed to from an early age on their phones and on the internet is horrifying to me. You would never allow a young child to walk into an X-rated movie theater and watch what's on the screen. But yet that happens every day, all the time. And you hear all sorts of excuses about why we can't protect our kids from internet pornography and all the other dangers that are out there. The fact is the technology does exist to protect them. We just don't have the will to enforce it and put the legislation in place. I would like to tackle that when I get to Congress. It's part of what I do in my job. I deliver training to teachers and to students on how to protect themselves online. And there are concrete policy steps that we can take to protect our kids.
Everybody's interested in reducing the cost of healthcare, but I understand beyond that, you want to expand access to mental health and addiction services. What's missing that you'd like to fill in?
So my wife and I have really been crusaders in this idea of trying to help provide additional services for first responders and guardsmen and reservists, and that includes psychological services and mental health services. That's where our efforts have really focused on. My own son is a member of the National Guard, and he's actually one of hundreds of Pennsylvania soldiers who are heading overseas right now to a very dangerous place in the Horn of Africa to implement American national security policy. And it's interesting that when you're in the Guard and Reserves, you don't live on a big military base. You're out in the communities, you're out in the neighborhoods, and when you deploy, your family is left behind. In the case of Will, my son right now, Susan and I don't really need anything. He doesn't have any kids, he doesn't have a wife, so, we can manage with Will overseas. But let's say he had a young family at home, and now he's gone. And, mom has to take care of the kids by herself, like my wife had to do when I was gone. All those support services that exist for the active duty aren't available to her. And that includes simple things like finding somebody to help you walk the dog, but also very important things like mental health and services to make sure that the families are okay while the soldiers are away doing really important work. I also really want to focus on expanding maternal health care. That's something that I don't think is talked about nearly enough. I think it's under fire in Pennsylvania right now by Democrats who are letting this get all caught up in the abortion debate. Let me give you a perfect example. In my district, there's an organization called the K. Galgon Lifehouse, and they do amazing charitable work for women. They basically will take a woman who is in trouble with an unplanned pregnancy, who is homeless and needs a safe place to stay. And they let her stay there for the duration of the pregnancy. And after she gives birth to the baby, they teach her parenting skills. They help her, with job training. They get her diapers. They give her baby formula, and they make sure that she has access to great health care while she's in that nurturing environment. Well, wouldn't you know, the Democrats have cut funding for that program, and they're diverting that money to abortion providers. And this is happening at the state level, and it's happening at the federal level. And who would ever target an organization like the K. Galgon Lifehouse, who's providing such services to those women? But the problem is they have life in their name, so they're a target, and this is now happening all across Pennsylvania. I think we need to help women who are faced with unplanned pregnancies and difficult circumstances to have good options so that they can raise families and carry those babies to term.
So speaking of abortion policy and having various options, the federal government, as you know, has let states decide on the abortion policy. And what do you think about that development?
So I have strong personal convictions on the subject. I believe that an unborn child is a living human being, which requires protections. I think the debates that we have today are the degree and extent of what those protections are. Very few people I encounter say that there should be no protections at all. For example, in the Lehigh Valley, a young girl can take a bus across the Delaware River into New Jersey and get a late-term abortion without her parents knowing it. I don't know any moms that want that to happen to their own child. So while there are lots of debates and divisions about the extent of abortion limits that should be out there, there are a few things that I think we should all be able to agree on. Number one, parents should have a say if their children are going to get a major medical procedure like an abortion. We shouldn't be financing abortions with federal taxpayer money. And my goodness, can't we just say that if we are talking about an unborn child that feels pain and can survive outside the womb, that we can have limits on those types of procedures? Unfortunately, the Democratic lobby has become abortion all the time, on demand, wherever. And I don't think that my constituency supports that.
Here's another statement on your website, Kevin, I'd like you to expand on.
Sure.
You say the national debt crowds out every other priority. So what is this large debt costing our country in your estimation?
Yeah, so right as we were emerging from COVID and things were getting back to normal, this is where the Democrats really unleashed their barrage of borrowed money and federal spending on the economy, which has caused the inflation that we've been dealing with for the past 2 years. If you remember, it was, one bill after another, that totaled about $4 trillion of stimulus into the economy, and that devalued the dollar. And that's why we're paying more for all of these different things. Essentially, they were printing money, and we're all dealing with that today. It's resulted in higher interest rates, which makes it harder for businesses to grow and expand. And I've experienced that myself with my own business. It's destroyed the housing market. So it's extremely hard for people to find homes that are affordable for them right now. And it's stifled the ability of people to build new homes because the interest rates are so high and the mortgage rates are sticky. So if we can't get our federal spending under control, we're not going to be able to control inflation. We're not going to be able to get interest rates down to a normal level. And we're not going to get onto a normal glide path for our economy for some time to come. When I talk about crowding out other investment, we've reached the point where the debt service for our interest payments on our national debt is now approaching the size of our defense budget. My goodness. We have enough priorities that we have to spend money on in Washington. And if we're borrowing money and paying it to banks and foreigners and all sorts of people that we, have to pay back the bonds that they borrowed, in order to pay for our debt, that's like wasted money. And we've got to get it under control because, we risk becoming insolvent if we don't take serious steps to get our fiscal house in order. I think it's the biggest threat that we face to our economy, and it requires a different type of thinking down in Washington.
Well, let's consider my previous question and put more of a point on it and consider it this way, Kevin. Which, as far as waste is concerned, which federal programs should be eliminated?
I think that we should eliminate a lot of what the education department is doing and let the states have the purview of education like they were originally supposed to be doing. I don't like when the federal government puts mandates on states for education. That should be the job of the states. They do it well. They ought to be able to do that without federal government intervention. We need to take a look at our entire entitlement regimen. We've got to be able to take a look at all the spending that we have and be able to tackle it and get that under control. I would start with all the bills that were just passed by the Biden administration. You've got the CHIPS Act. You've got,
what was that one, Kevin?
So this is an amazing piece of legislation. It's called the CHIPS Act. And it's almost $300 billion worth of spending. And it was designed to try to help spur the semiconductor industry in the United States. A laudable goal, but just like most things that come out of the progressive Democrats, their intentions don't match reality. And let me tell you how that plays out in the Lehigh Valley. That CHIPS Act is so expensive that it costs every person in the Lehigh Valley about $1,600 per taxpayer. Okay. So that's their contribution to making sure that this CHIPS Act goes forward. And it's been more than 2 years since it's passed. And they've been talking about all these promises of all the high-tech businesses that's going to spur in the Lehigh Valley. And they've made one announcement so far about how the CHIPS Act has helped local business. And you know what it is? It's a warehouse in Palmer Township. So the Lehigh Valley is now dealing with the proliferation of distribution centers and warehouses like many people are across Pennsylvania. And a distribution center is not a semiconductor manufacturer. And, this is the type of wasteful spending that we're seeing again and again and again. It's one thing to say that you're going to, encourage a chip maker. It's another thing to take that money that's being forced upon the taxpayers in the Lehigh Valley and allocating it for a warehouse.
Here's another point I'd like to explore that I saw on your website. And you say that the Democrats want to spend money on what you call dirty energy materials produced mostly in China. So I know you have an alternative in mind. Tell us.
Yeah, so my background, my undergraduate degree was environmental resource management. And when I went to Syracuse, I had a research assistantship in environmental policy. And my first job in Albany was working on environmental policy. So I do have a background in it. And, right now we are doing some absurd things when it comes to our environmental policy. Let me give you an example. And I think this is what I was thinking about on the website. So right now, the Chinese are expanding their use of coal power plants because it produces cheap and abundant power for them to drive their manufacturing sector. And one of the reasons why they're so prolific at producing windmills and solar panels that they send to the American market is because they're producing them using their new coal-fired power plants that they built so that they have this enhanced manufacturing capability. We receive the solar panels and the windmills, and we take our own coal plants offline and replace them with the solar panels and the windmills that we've now purchased from China in the name of preventing climate change. It's insane. The Chinese are building more plants to produce the materials to send to us while we take them offline. And oh, by the way, it's not just dirty power that they're using to produce these plants. They're using slave labor. They have a population over there called the Uyghurs in a province that they imprison people and they put them in work camps and they produce materials and they ship them back to the United States. It is appalling to me that after all the things that we see the Chinese Communist Party doing to American businesses, our allies and their own people, that we acknowledge all this stuff and then want to cut another trade deal with them.
Kevin, we have just a few minutes left.
Yes.
How would you rate our government's handling of funding the war in Ukraine?
So I think right now the House Republicans have it right by trying to make sure that before we do anything else, we get this border crisis under control. I don't think it's in the compelling national interest for us to continue to send money to Ukraine so they can try to recapture all the lost territory that Russia already has. For example, in the Crimea. I do think that it is in our vital national interest to make sure that Russia does not take Kiev and control all of Ukraine, because if that happens, it's going to be a real problem for the security of Europe and the United States.
And how about the war with Hamas? That immediately comes to mind too. What do you think of our handling of that?
So, people always want to talk about how we handle that war, but I always bring it back to how it started, okay? It started with a horrific terrorist attack against innocent Israelis that was the scope and scale larger proportionally than what we experienced during 9/11. Hamas is evil. And Israel is correct to say that unless they take out Hamas's leadership and their warfighting capabilities, the minute that they stop fighting, the minute that they put them back in power, Israel is just going to be attacked again. I think we need to give Israel the benefit of the doubt how they're prosecuting that war and support them as they go to vanquish that terrorist organization.
Kevin, we have less than 1 minute left in our program, so use that remaining time, please, and tell our viewers in District 7 why they should vote for you.
I'm different because I'm not a career politician. I have 28 years of military experience, 18 years of business experience, and I've lived in the community for 40 years. I want to bring those relevant skills to the toughest issues that we face in Washington as a common sense conservative to solve problems and then come back home to Gurmansville.
Kevin Dellicker, Republican for Congress in District 7.
Thank you very much. Absolutely.